to be careful, but they'll do. It's hard to be live all the time.
Right.
Victor.
Yeah, that's well, it's
Yeah.
not really. And you will assume the sunlight will something to avoid now. I'll grant you. Oh, Chris,
The blood. Indeed. Would you please bring that to Dr. Naru at the hospital? Ask him to do the usual test. Ça va bien. She lives on Rue Penet,
Rude
number
honey.
23. She forgets stuff all the time, and
You get
she
stuff.
went on vacation. Hello. Great, thank you. Oh, by the way, Eknor let me know that Catherine would be happy to chat with you. She's usually at her office at night. She manages the funeral co-op on Papineau Boulevard. It's called Urgel Bourgie.
Snacks.
Bonsoir.
Vous l'avez trouvé, en effet. Bien sûr.
Besoin d'autre chose?
Fuck. I did it like months ago and I already don't remember how it's done. It's not noisy. Oh no, that's fine. So, quelle solution work? Whoa! Whoa! Okay. I guess I'll do better. Hmm.
a slightly different level, the equally naive thought of the scientist, bound to the obvious by the requirements of his speciality, when he illegitimately attempts to extend scientific criteria beyond their proper bounds. End quote. He's basically attacking scientism, and not what he calls legitimate science. He hates its exploitation in the modern world, but he is not attacking science as a means of knowledge, just the ideological metaphysics behind how these think tanks populate themselves in society. Throughout the following pages, in regards to realism and scientism, he talks about how its nihilistic metaphysics conjoins to the making of something like Marxist realism, and how the radically simple solutions that were presented by the likes of Hitler, Mussolini, Lenin, and Stalin. I quote, "The Christian has found the only answer in God and his Son. The realist, out of contact with Christian life and the truth that animates it, asks the question in a spiritual vacuum and is content to accept the first answer he finds. Mistaking Christianity for another form of idealism, he rejects it and becomes a fanatical devotee of the only reality that is obvious to the spiritually blind, this world. Now, much as it is possible to admire the earnestness of the devoted materialist and atheist, not even the greatest charity can induce us to recognize in him of a love of truth that has gone astray, become a disease, and ended in its own negation. The motives of the realist are in fact not pure. He claims to know what, by his own theory and knowledge, cannot be known. We have seen the denial of absolute truth is itself an absolute, and if he does so, it is because he has an ulterior motive, because he places some other worldly value above truth." End quote. And then he goes on to talking about the Nietzschean Superman being a so-called truth seeker, trying to excavate the true man. He links this to Marxist realism and revolutionary rebellion, how the love for truth is prostituted for an irrational cause, and how that itself becomes an enemy of truth and destroys the premise for truth itself. But what really interests me in this book, above all his other ideas, is his view on vitalism. He basically states, and Nietzsche does also, that science as it is of itself is not capable of completely replacing the death of God, which is where nihilism essentially sprouted from in his opinion. One reason why is because it doesn't bring about any existential relief. So what Father Rose says is that vitalism is introduced to bring about a pseudo-religiosity or pseudo-spirituality, which is a reaction against the realist simplifications which are presented through scientism, positivism and materialism. This vitalism is brought about because the simplification of reality doesn't bring about any kind of transcendental punch to the soul. For example, you can see how Marxism, even though they were atheists, had a pseudo-religious twang with how they represented the proletariat or the new man. And of course, you had vitalism in the environment of psychedelics, and of course, modern and postmodern art, where the idea of whatever is most physically outstanding wins the prize, as that is the only designation when a society's value systems are made null and void. Anything that is the opposite of traditionalism is the winner because it is a continuous progression away from the past. As in the past we had values, so therefore that is the only direction a nihilistic society can go, for example. So in response to today, is there a representation of science being infused with a form of pseudo-religious spiritual vitalism due to its simplifications being too bland for the young, or for it to replace the death of God, to serve a purpose, a cathartic distraction away from the nihilism of humanity in the constant attempt for the search of meaning? I would say yes. I think the repercussions of climate change is a perfect example. Young people in an age of atheism, in an age of nihilism, at its highest degree than ever before, have never loved science so dearly. Science itself, as said by Nietzsche, cannot replace God, but it can, I believe, if given the supposed perfect cause. and if you can fulfill the empty slot which religion holds and science does not. And that is, as I said before, existential relief. Climate activism does that perfectly, especially for the young, lost people of today. And who else better than little Greta Thunberg, the new Jesus, to forward this religious activism? And then, of course, the organisation Extinction Rebellion, who basically partake in pseudo-spiritual ritual nearly every time they do a demonstration. So it's very, very interesting, and it made me think of an idea I thought of recently in relation to nihilism, which I call cathartic nihilism. Because all of this activism everywhere, especially today, which was never really there as such an immensity before the death of God, as Nietzsche claimed, all follows a nihilistic trend in the specific relation to human existence with regards to existential meaning, and that is that all human action from the past presents itself as being meaningless. Therefore, dedication to something that will bring me a catharsis, a relief against the specifically meaningless existence of humanity itself, to bring myself relief from the nihilism of human existence, to dedicate myself to something beyond me as a person, beyond me as a human, with pseudo-religiosity, so that it acts as a useful distraction from my own and the new generation of humanity's modern nihilism. And I think this is existent in many forms of radical thinking within activism today, especially in climate activism, some areas around veganism, and in antinatalism. It could be said that antinatalism is the embodiment of cathartic nihilism, because the antinatalist would actually get a relief, a catharsis, by knowing that people will stop continuing to exist. To dedicate my life in being an antinatalist, preaching that there is no real beneficial value to existence, so therefore you shouldn't have children. They are in a way contradictory, because if they actually believed that there was more suffering than pleasure within this idea of the asymmetry of pleasure and pain, then they would actually do themselves in, because they would realise that doing so would prevent them from further lifelong suffering, and doing so would outweigh any pleasure that they experience on a pleasure-to-pain basis, because they know that they wouldn't be contending with the remains of their lifelong suffering. But they don't do that. Obviously, suicide is an extremely difficult attempt when it comes to willpower and mental fortitude, and I hope that no one ever attempts to do so, because people have so much unrealised potential for good. But if these antinatalists were really dedicated to such a belief in the philosophy's full embodiment, they would do it, wouldn't they? But obviously there are pleasurable things in life that are valuable, that do outweigh the pain presented to us in the world, which are worth living for. But continuing the existence of life is a disease and an immoral act to them, maybe even a sin. And what is the purest form of nihilism? Destruction. How would you destroy everything? You would have to destroy mankind. Everything ever known, gone. Another area I think it is active in is in veganism, by those who go out on the streets with anonymous masks and present to the unconsenting public animal cruelty which is blindly normalised in the animal industry, which is obviously wrong, which I'm completely against. The reason why I think this activism is a form of cathartic nihilism is because these activists, especially the radical activists, not all vegans of course, don't care, or in his or her radical activism has no relational value system with regards to the public people or the people who are not them, as they may refer. They care in expressing the truth, don't get me wrong, but they don't seem to care about the means of expressing that truth. So therefore the public, or the people, or the child that is more than likely to be mentally scarred by seeing such animal brutality publicly displayed for everyone to see. So people who are against snuff films, for example, which I hope everyone is, by the way, are not going to start publicly displaying these disgusting films on large flat-screen TVs to the unconsenting public who already know about their existence as a form of activism. Well, I hope they don't, because it is disturbing and therefore violating public consent. And no one wants to see that shit anyway. We already know about it. We already know about these types of things, so bring some kind of consent into it with regards to vegan demonstrations like this. But on top of that, they also wear an anonymous mask. Why? One reason is obviously because they want people to pay attention to what they are showing, for there to not be any other distractions to that which is needed of the highest attention, but it is also for them to not be publicly responsible for what they are showing, because if they did, I'm sure they would get a lot of nasty looks for a start, and also because it is a form of catharsis. Wearing a mask detaches a person from the rest of society. If you're going to condemn humans, human activity, and to be nihilistic about them in general, what better way to do it than by detaching yourself from the rest of them? As being a cathartic nihilist, you get a relief by condemning humans in general with regards to their traditional long-lived activities. It is very interesting how all these three causes for activism are in some way or another all related. So many associate themselves to all three, which is climate activism, veganism, and antinatalism in their most radical expressions. When I'm talking about this, I'm mostly referring to the radicals, but it is also the radicals that are the ever-growing dimension in society. Young people today are extremely radicalized, even in America, and the major reason for this radicalism is, I think, only because it gives some kind of meaning to people's lives in an age of nihilism. So you get these people hypnotized with an aggressive, nihilistic, Thanatos-like state, similar to how Freud described the death drive, and it won't come as a surprise, especially in America, for a democratic structure, or a liberal democracy, if there ever was one, to completely fall apart in the future due to systematic nihilism among the young generation, who find meaning in their lives by attaching themselves to anarchist political groups. But as I have described, this cathartic nihilism, which is in response to the contemporary interpretation of meaning, value, and modern human existence, leads simply to the devotion of what all these three forms of activism associate: climate change. The catharsis or existential relief is rooted in worshipping that which is furthest away from being human itself, which is either negation of human existence, animals, or the planet. These three ideals bring about attention away from the nihilism of human existence to something beyond human itself. Thus, pseudo-religiosity or pseudo-spirituality towards such said interests are understandable. Radical worship, as it is acted out by the radicals themselves, is understandable when accepting this philosophy. When looking at the structure of cathartic nihilism, sacrificing the human is the root core, unaccepted or accepted endgame of this philosophy. How can the climate, God, for example, be fulfilled, or what is the best way to reduce CO2 emissions? Or what is the best way to fulfill complete catharsis? Antinatalism gives the most radical answer to this question, even if it does not yet accept it yet in its complete formation. Just how nihilism's complete embodiment is destruction itself. Complete relief would be fulfilled for the cathartic nihilist if only the human existence can be imploded from reality. The most cathartic thing to do, to distract one away from the accepted nihilism of human existence, would be to end it entirely, instead of devoting oneself towards what brings about a condemnation of human activity, which stems the catharsis itself, such as climate activism, veganism, or antinatalism, a pagan-like sacrifice for the climate, self-inflicted or not, may be the final solution for an enduring philosophy like cathartic nihilism. But that is if it even exists. That is, as I am hypothesizing here, in relation to the behaviours of radical expressions within these groups. So yeah, what do you think of that? Just to make sure to anyone watching this video who is offended, I am mostly talking about the possible psychology behind the radical expression of certain activism among the young generation in regards to this realm of activism, and it is specifically relating to the radical expression. So I'd love to see what you thought of this video. Make sure to give it a like if you enjoyed it, comment your thoughts down below, subscribe, and I hope you have a lovely day. Thanks for watching. always contemplated the big question, meaning of life, in the wrong way. The question itself is incorrect and needs to be reworked. If anything, reversed. Man should not ask what the meaning of life is, but rather should recognize that it is he who is asked. It is man who is questioned by life itself, not man questioning life. Therefore, it is not the question of what is the meaning of life, but rather what does life mean to me? To answer for the existence of one's own life, it is of primary necessity to see that one can only respond to such a question by being responsible. Responsibility is therefore the essence of human existence. Viktor E. Frankl was an Austrian neurologist, psychiatrist, and a Holocaust survivor. After surviving such terrors, he wrote one of his most popular books, Man's Search for Meaning, and developed the psychological therapeutic doctrine called logotherapy, whereby logos in Greek means meaning, therefore meaning therapy. He asked the question, what drives humanity? His conclusion was this, the will to meaning. It was the desire for meaning that made people continue on living. This view would contradict other psychoanalytic viewpoints at the time. For example, Freud believed in the will to pleasure, and Adler believed in the will to power. Man's search for meaning for Frankl was man's primary motivation in his life, and certainly not something of a secondary rationalization of instinctual drives, as Freud would call it. As I quote, there are some authors who contend that meanings and values are nothing but defense mechanisms, reaction formations, and sublimations. But as for myself, I would not be willing to live merely for the sake of my defense mechanisms, nor would I be ready to die merely for the sake of my reaction formations. Man, however, is able to live and even to die for the sake of his ideals and values. End quote. From his experiences in the Holocaust, Frankl saw something empirical at its most extreme that would detonate psychological fatalism. This was all part of what Frankl called the collective neurosis, which is that of nihilism, the belief that being itself has no meaning. Frankl saw that the fatalistic conditioning of science on mankind would only make the nihilistic neurotic believe themselves as a pawn and victim of outer and inner influences and circumstances, thus denying man's freedom and making the existential vacuum ever so bigger. I quote, "This neurotic fatalism is fostered and strengthened by a psychological therapy which denies that man is free." End quote. What Frankl saw beyond the conceptions of determinism and scientific fatalism was that, on a foundational level, man's ability to withstand conditions is a definition of freedom. This understanding did not neglect the reality of man's deterministic nature, but saw, with insight from the Holocaust, that man is capable of defying and braving the worst conditions conceivable, even those with the sole intent to destroy. Different wills, in my view, which through mere force of being, meaning, power, or pleasure, push back the deterministic will to its final endpoint, whereby the will itself isolates determinism as of where it should be. Within this relative space of start to end or will to finality, there lies a degree of freedom which allows one to be capable or incapable of defying or acquiescing towards conditions of a brutal nature. In relation to the will to meaning, this is of a highest degree. It is all dependent on how much one withstands to bear in the search for meaning. Thus, within the will to meaning, there is a degree of freedom. The way in which logotherapy deviates from psychoanalysis is that it considers man as a being whose main concern consists in fulfilling a meaning, rather than in the mere gratification and satisfaction of drives and instincts, or in merely reconciling the conflicting claims of id, ego, and superego, or in the mere adaptation and adjustment to society and environment. What he saw in the concentration camps was that people who knew there was a task waiting for them to fulfill were most apt to survive. Hence the Nietzschean quote, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." Because of this, Frankl saw that for a good mental health, a tension needs to be of existence. That tension would most precisely be, I quote, "the gap between what one is and what one should become." He saw that it was extremely dangerous to presuppose the need for equilibrium or a tensionless state, because what man really needs is, I quote, not a tensionless state, but rather the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal, a freely chosen task, end quote. Something that Frankl saw as being the widespread phenomenon of the 20th century and thus causing a loss of meaning was what he called the existential vacuum. He said that it was the result of two fundamental occurrences: one, the loss of tradition, and two, loss of animal instinct. The fact that man has to make a choice puts the prospect of paradise and security at a halt. I quote, "No instinct tells him what he has to do, and no tradition tells him what he ought to do. Sometimes he does not even know what he wishes to do. Instead, he either wishes to do what other people do, conformism, or he does what other people wish him to do, totalitarianism." End quote. Another quote, he says, "The existential vacuum manifests itself mainly in a state of boredom." Now we can understand Schopenhauer when he said that mankind was apparently doomed to vacillate eternally between the two extremes of distress and boredom. End quote. Depression, aggression, and addiction. This is what you could call the mass neurotic triad of the people. But this is what Frankl saw as a result of the existential vacuum of the 20th century. All three of these have nothing but skyrocketed since the appearance of the existential vacuum. His attack against Alderian and Freudian psychoanalysis in relation to the will to power and will to pleasure is based on the fact that the existential vacuum can mask itself behind these different strivings of the will. I quote, "There are various masks and guises under which the existential vacuum appears. Sometimes the frustrated will to meaning is vicariously compensated for by a will to power, including the most primitive form of the will to power, the will to money. In other cases, the place of frustrated will to meaning is taken by the will to pleasure. This is why existential frustration often eventuates to sexual compensation. We can observe in such cases that the sexual libido becomes rampant in the existential vacuum." End quote. We can see how Frankl's answer to the meaning of life is very similar to Camus' view of the meaning to life. Camus makes the proposition of revolt against suicide, freedom against ideology, and passion for living without hope. Camus' view of passion for life is similar to Frankl's reversal question of the meaning to life, which is that of what is your calling, what is life's calling to you. But Frankl does view that there are three fundamental objective ways in which we can find meaning in life, that is through deed, love, and suffering. In reference to love, this meaning can be attained just by experiencing something, whether it be goodness, beauty, truth, nature, or culture, but also by experiencing another human being, whereby these qualities can be the embodiment of another individual. The meaning of love is located in the ability for another person to release the beloved's potentialities into the mind so that they can become actualized. This is the motion that unfolds when the partner sees the possibilities of the other, thus making them come true. In the process of love, a partner can give rise to the realization of their potential, which therefore gives their lives meaning. This can work in a reciprocal manner. Suffering, on the other hand, can give rise to meaning when a personal tragedy is turned into triumph. For example, the realization and understanding of suffering gives an artist the pure groundwork to produce a beautiful tragic painting, whereby the meaning of life could be for the artist to express life in art. We can develop a meaning to suffering by simply changing the attitude and the way we look at it. For example, let's say as a husband, your wife, or vice versa, has died from an illness and you have been in despair ever since. Thus you ask the question to yourself, what if this was reversed? What if it happened to me and not her? Well, she would obviously also be in great despair and suffering, but what we can conclude is that because that is not the case, the suffering has been spared, and it is you who has spared her this suffering at the price that now you have to survive and mourn her. So by changing the attitude in how we see despair, we can uproot a meaning which gives a purpose to our existence. Carl Jung also noticed the collective neurosis that Frankl previously mentioned, saying the following, I quote, Man cannot stand a meaningless life. The least of things with a meaning is worth more in life than the greatest of things without it. It is only the things we don't understand that have any meaning. Man woke up in a world he did not understand, and that is why he tries to interpret it. About a third of my cases are suffering from no clinically defiable neurosis, but from the senselessness and emptiness of their lives. This can be defined as the general neurosis of our times. End quote. Another quote, he says, "The only meaningful life is a life that strives for the individual realization, absolute and unconditional, of its own particular law. To the extent that a man is untrue to the law of his being, he has failed to realize his own life's meaning." End quote. Jung also identified that individual realization was at the heart of finding a meaning to life. He put great emphasis on the individuation process, but the method which allows one to become self-realized is approached through a method called circumambulation. This is the idea that through continuous potential as an individual, interests manifest themselves in present life. These interests are those which will help you realize what it is that will hopefully allow you to gravitate towards your ideal self. But the problem here is that obviously you will begin as the archetypal fool, as that is always the case before becoming a master in whatever it is that you idolize. Therefore, there are continuous diversions which one will make, so it's never a linear psychological evolution. It's more circular, but by every inch you are slowly rotating inwards to attain the center of the self. It's no different from a maze, and maybe even the concept and creation of the maze is a conscious or unconscious representation of circumambulation, because one enters into the game of life from all different entrances, but then one is continuously confronted with physical and mental walls until reaching the center. Frankl's logotherapy is, I think, very much an antidote to existential problems, because it is the only psychological therapy produced specifically for confronting the existential vacuum, nihilism, and the different ways in which the will to meaning can become submerged under the ever-present neurotic triad of aggression, addiction, and depression in the modern age. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below to get involved in the discussion. Talking about discussion, you can find a link to the New Thoughts and Thinking Facebook group down below, so make sure to join if you want to get involved in conversations about philosophy, sociology, psychology, and literature. Make sure to follow my social media such as Instagram and Twitter to keep up to date with everything that is going on, and also Patreon, where you can donate a minimum of $2. Lastly, a quick shout out to my patrons. Thank you to Danielle Kazmi, The Truthism, Noah, Shahad, and John for supporting me on Patreon. Thanks for watching, and I will speak to you in the next video. Dostoevsky's protagonist, the Underground Man in Notes from Underground, covers many different philosophical concepts. One of them was utopianism. I'd even go to say that this book is one of the best books which critique utopianism, guided by a rational positivism. The main argument against utopianism for the Underground Man is that there is no existence of rationality in mankind. Because of this, a scientific positivism and rational egoism to formulate a utopian society is impossible. Why? Because man is fundamentally irrational. Mankind cannot be slotted into a fitting compartment of meaningful, purposeful existence and be content forever. We are not questionable subjects with a definite corresponding answer. If anything, we are questionable subjects and indefinite creatures when it comes to finding meaning and purpose in our lives. What is most evident is this: as Dostoevsky writes, we are very much like chess players, fond of the process of achieving his or her goals rather than reaching the goal itself. Perhaps the whole goal towards which mankind is striving in this world consists solely in the uninterrupted process of achievement. As I quote, "Man loves to construct and lay down roads, no question about it, but why is he so passionately fond of destruction and chaos? Just as an ant will build an anthill and finish such with a positive outlook, man is much more a superficial and unseemly creature. 2 times 2 is 4. This is very much the formula that Dostoevsky uses as an example of the rational mathematical principle which is to be foundation to the building of the rational utopian positivist world. But the underground man finds distaste in this, because it does not follow the human nature that we live by, that people are not piano keys or organ stops by which he refers. If a formula so does exist, then man will stop desiring. He will be man without volition, without human nature. It will become calculated into logarithms, whereby all will have a sound, manageable, expected, predictable conclusion. This formula he speaks of is no longer life, but the beginning of death itself. As I quote, "Man has always somehow been afraid of this 2 × 2 is 4, and I'm still afraid of it. Let's suppose that man does nothing but seek out his 2 × 2 is 4 formula, sails across oceans, devoting his life to the quest, but never really finding it. God, he's afraid of it somehow. You see, he feels that once he found it, there'll be nothing left to look for. Where can man go?" End quote. I love this because he alludes to God here. I personally think this is strikingly intentional. In the age of modernity, the Enlightenment, the irrational principle expelled onto man's complete earthly disposition, will make man nihilistic, deprived, godless. I see it really as man being afraid of losing God in the process, and that he is afraid of what this formula will do to everything and everything that man has known. I quote, "What will become of your will once the whole business ends up with tables and arithmetic? When only 2 × 2 is 4 is in demand, 2 × 2 will make 4 without my willing it. So much for your will." End quote. Here Dostoevsky is referring to the core advantageous advantage of the human spirit, which is free will, that which makes you irrational, catalyst for that irrationality, which is excessive free will be lost forever. So let me get to the fundamental point that makes this book truly important. To be honest, the most frightening element of this book. He talks about the rational utopia, the end of free will being the catalyst for your innate irrationality, how everything will be predicted through tables of a positivist perspective, and how it will never work, so on and so on, but he makes a crucial distinction. That in all its attempts, because of the primary importance of free will in all of mankind, the glass will crack, and that the modernist scientific rational outlook is very much a fallacy. I quote, "One may say anything about the history of the world, anything that might enter the most disordered imagination. The only thing one cannot say is that it is rational. The very word sticks in one's throat. And indeed, this is even the kind of thing that continually happens. After all, there are continually turning up in life moral and rational people, sages and lovers of humanity, who make it their goal for life to live as morally and rationally as possible, to be, so to speak, a light to their neighbours, simply in order to show them that it is really possible to live morally and rationally in this world. And so what? We all know that those very people, sooner or later, towards the end of their lives, have been false to themselves, playing some trick, often a most indecent one. Now I ask you, what can one expect from man since he is a creature endowed with such strange qualities? Shower him every earthly blessing, drown him in bliss, so that nothing but bubbles would dance on the surface of his bliss, as on a sea. Give him such economic prosperity that he would have nothing else to do but sleep, eat cakes, and busy himself with ensuring the continuation of world history, and even then, man out of sheer ingratitude would play you some loathsome trick. He would even risk his cakes and would deliberately desire the most fatal rubbish, the most uneconomical absurdity, simply to introduce into all this positive rationality his fatal, fantastic element. It is just his fantastic dreams, his vulgar folly, that he will desire to retain, simply in order to prove to himself, as though that were so necessary, that men are still men and not piano keys, which even if played by the laws of nature themselves, threaten to be controlled so completely that soon one will be able to desire nothing but by the calendar. And after all, that is not all. Even if man really were nothing but a piano key, even this were proved to him by natural science and mathematics, even then he would not become reasonable, but would purposely do something perverse out of sheer ingratitude, simply to have his own way. And if he does not find any means, he will devise destruction and chaos, will devise sufferings of all sorts, and will thereby have his own way. He will launch a curse upon the
Ok, c'est
world,
vrai.
and
Tu parles pas
as only
français?
man
What's
can
up?
curse, it is his privilege, the primary distinction between man and other animals,
Oh,
then,
Chris, c'est vrai.
after all, perhaps only by his curse will he attain his
Yeah,
object,
bringing back.
that is,
Yeah,
really
she's a
convince
smart
himself
cookie.
that he
She
is a
lives
man
above
and
the
not a
bike shop
piano key.
on
If you
Russell
say
Street,
that
just
all
after
this
Pepper.
too can be calculated and tabulated, chaos and darkness and curses, so that the mere possibility of calculating it all beforehand, stop it all, and reason would reassert itself, then man would purposely go mad in order to be rid of reason and to have his own way. I believe in that. I vouch for it. Because after all, the whole work of man seems really to consist in nothing but proving to himself continually that he is a man and not an organ stop. It may be at the cost of his skin, but he has proved it. He may become a caveman, but he will have proved it. And after that can one help sinning, rejoicing that it has not yet come, and that desire still depends on the devil as what. End quote.
Go on.
That to me is the most frightening part of the book, the most true of it all, but it is that man will deliberately go insane in order to be rid of reason and still have things his own way. And it is if you spot the associations, Dostoevsky is pointing towards the downfall of an attempted utopia. They fall into a dystopia because man cannot be a rational being with cohesive, conclusive counterparts. You could say that Dostoevsky predicts the not-so-distant future of mathematical madnesses such as the Soviet and communist Chinese state and, of course, the German-Italian authoritarianism of the early 20th century. This is of utmost importance, that man can't remain as a piano key in an attempted utopia, but that it will be a dystopia of authoritarianism, that the underground men who reside in the cracks of the earth will rise and use their resentment as political charisma. Who could be a better example than Hitler, a man who had the physical and behavioural attributes of the underground man himself, and someone who used resentment
Does he
and what
like...
Nietzsche called imaginary revenge
Go ahead.
to create
Just
a
go through
world
that door
of
and take
chaos
the stairs
and
to the left.
destruction. Dostoevsky acknowledges the madness of man and mankind's irrationality, but most importantly, that this is an extremely delicate thread, that when man attempts to constrict its own human nature, it may create a disastrous chemical reaction, that the strange human condition which we are may produce not a utopianism followed by rationality, but a dystopian authoritarianism, which is guided by powers that desire to demonstrate the devil's own free will. Free will for the sake of free will, a will which is made into reality to prove that man is not rational and cannot be equally placed as jigsaw to form a finality of perfect happiness. So Orwell. The reason why I am going to compare this to Orwell is because 1984 sees the same key points but through a different lens. Instead of a book that panders towards the irrationality of man and that the most advantageous of all advantages is free will, it instead plays out what Dostoevsky says in his book. It brings to light Dostoevsky's conclusion in how hyper-rationalism can influence totalitarian irrationalism, which represents the disappearance of the human personality. The dystopian world of 1984 apply both to Stalin and Hitler's regimes, which can be seen as caused by excessively perverted outgrowths coming from Enlightenment and counter-Enlightenment ideals. I first want to talk about the formula where 2 times 2 equals 4, which represents the rational, but another formula is used in both Notes from Underground and 1984 to represent the irrational. This formula is 2 times 2 equals 5. This is a key signifier that makes these two books stand out much more than any other dystopian novels. because both refer to the reality of an irrational formula as something that does happen, something that does emerge from the cracks and can, as we can see in 1984, cause for a dystopian irrationality. As I quote from Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky writes, "I admit that 2 times 2 makes 4 is an excellent thing, but if we are going to praise everything, 2 times 2 makes 5 is something also a very charming little thing." End quote. The same approach is taken in Orwell's 1984, as I quote, "You are a slow learner, Winston," said O'Brien gently. "How can I help seeing what is in front of my eyes? 2 and 2 are 4. Sometimes, Winston, sometimes they are 5. End quote. So here both these books are erring towards and acknowledging the fact that hyper-reality, rational dictatorship, and a desire for a utopia can turn violently into a irrational authoritarianism. A key difference between the two books is that the Underground Man himself is very much fighting against a rational utopia, as if it is something that will be accepted as the ultimate truth, that it will be nothing but the salvation since the death of God. But in 1984 it is different. The rulers in the book have abandoned the ideal of a universal happiness, but still use the concept of a universal happiness for propaganda purposes. We also see that Goldstein alludes to the fact that the machine was worthwhile and that a true utopia was possible, while the Underground Man knows that it will never work. Orwell alludes through one character that it could. I quote, "From the moment when the machine first made its appearance, it was clear to all thinking people that the need for human drudgery, and therefore to a great extent for human inequality, had disappeared. If the machine were used deliberately for that end, hunger, overwork, dirt, illiteracy, and disease could be eliminated within a few generations. And in fact, without being used for any such purpose, but by a sort of automatic process, by producing wealth which it was sometimes impossible not to distribute. The machine did raise the living standards of the